This channel is supported by Truefire. Truefire is an online library
enough. You can get the Truefire All Access Pass for as cheap as they ever do it, the $99 thing. So just jump and do that if you're looking for the best price you can get Truefire All Access for. One of the things that I think we quite often think of when it comes to modeling versus using a real amp, there's a few things that come into play. I think cost is one of the things, weight and space is one of the other things. Of course, like tone and stuff like that. Now, I think in terms of tone, I think this is a little bit of a tricky one. I think in some cases, a lot of us might be, fans of tube amps and think actually there's something there that maybe modeling doesn't always get there 100% of the time. But anyway, so that's kind of not really part of this video. I kind of wanted to look at two rigs which are reasonably equivalent and kind of go through what it might cost, so and also the weight. So I've got the Tonex cab, which is what I'm using. Like a Fender FR12 is very similar, a bit cheaper, but Tonex cab is what I've actually got, so I thought I'd use that. I've got a Fractal FM9, which I think is one of the more expensive modelers, but kind of actually in terms of footprint and power is probably one of the ones that is like that reasonable sort of trade-off. Of course, there's things like Quad Cortex, which are smaller, or HX Stomp, but I think running a full show on like a FM9 or a full Helix might be a little bit easier to compare in some ways to an actual pedal board. So that's on one side, and then on the other side I've got a Fender Deluxe Reverb and my pedal board. So in terms of weight, the Fender Deluxe Reverb reissue is 19 kilos, whereas the Tonex cab is like just under 13. So there is a bit of a weight saving there, which is, like a third lighter, right? So 33% lighter, maybe something like that. I think the Fender FR12 is probably a bit similar. So you could make a weight saving there. I think one of the things with an amp is that in many cases you're kind of carrying it on one side. And one of the things that I hear from some of the guys that are maybe a bit older is that actually they kind of wish that they'd gone for something lighter a bit earlier on in their lives rather than waiting for this. So a real weight saving, I guess about 30% if you go from a tube amp to a Tonex cab. Now, a little thing I could do with Deluxe Reverb, which might save a couple of kilos, maybe would be to change that speaker out for a Neo speaker. Other things to consider, obviously, like a head-end cabinet, which in many cases would mean that you'd have the weight at least split into two different bits. So that's one thing. The other thing is the pedal boards. Now I think I've got my pedal board here. I think this probably weighs somewhat similar, like a Fractal FM9 is about 5.5 kilos, a Helix is similar weight. I think this weighs similar, basically. I'd say this is like a medium-sized pedal board, really. Probably, like, it's not excessive. There's 3 drives, an EQ, compressor, delay, and an HX stomp. I think that's a fairly middle of the road. Like, we're not using any gig rig stuff. We're not using any really heavy stuff or like lots of pedals, but something fairly middle of the road. So about the same. So will you make a saving versus a pedal board? If you've got a lot of pedals, potentially the Fractal FM9 is potentially going to be like in that, particularly if you went down like a Quad Cortex route or something like that, you probably make a saving there. Now another thing to mention would be the cost of the amp. So the amp costs at the moment £1,555 at Thomann, and the Tonex cab is about 675. So you know, deluxe reverb, not the cheapest amp you could get. You could definitely get an amp for around that sort of 685. I think something like a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe, what would that cost? Around about 1,000. You could go cheaper than that still as well. But so I think you could probably actually, compared to the Tonex cab, which is, as I said, 675-ish, just under 700, I think you could find an amp for that. My deluxe reverb I bought used. It gets a bit more complicated if you do used prices, of course, but I got that used for like 800. Now, in terms of the pedal board thing, this is one area where I think it's in many cases quite easy to make a saving versus the modeler. As in, if you bought a modeler, it might be cheaper. So this 229, about 100. About 170. HX Stomp is like 530 at the moment. The Dell Mini is 85. This compressor is over 200, and this drive is over 200. So I think you could definitely build a cheaper pedal board than this if you've got like 3 Boss pedals. You know, that delay's already reasonably priced. You could use a Boss line selector instead of this one. That might be worth thinking about, and just like a Boss compressor. The HX Stomp actually kind of works out fairly reasonably because I'm using it for a couple of delays and reverbs, as well as the tuner, so that covers a few things. And then the actual board itself, when you think about costs and power supply. So I think it's quite easy to even, like, I'd say this is fairly mid sort of priced. Like, this is not anything particularly special. This is over sort of £2,000 worth, like 2,100, whereas the Fractal FM9, which is, you know, one of the top tier modelers, one of the more expensive ones, is £1,899. So that's an area that you could potentially make a saving. So I think altogether, you might be able to make a bit of a cost saving, but, you know, the Tonex cab and a modeler, probably a bit lighter, probably a bit cheaper, if you're using, you know, like a reasonably priced board. And then some of the other things to consider, I guess, like space taken up, I don't think there's a huge difference, unless you definitely go for one of the really much smaller modeling solutions, where the trade-off is that they're not quite as flexible in terms of switching lots of things in and out. This is already a very compact tube amp. I guess like a Fender Princeton Reverb might not be a terrible shout for this sort of thing. Then the other thing with the modeling device is that in some cases you could probably do away with the cab altogether, which is one of the things, like if you're going pedal board with an amp, you're going to have an additional rig alongside that. So reasonably, I think there are some arguments, you know, aside from whether there's like tonal benefits either way, the modeling with an FRFR type situation might be in most cases sort of a bit cheaper, a little bit potentially smaller, but we also maybe factor in that probably if you don't already have a modeling device, you don't have an FRFR. So in which case you could also very reasonably do the modeler with a real amp hybrid setup, which I've used for years, which actually I think gets you kind of the best of both worlds, where like a traditional pedal board is not necessarily as versatile as a Fractal FM9, for example, or as plentiful in terms of like delays and reverbs and, you know, switching things on the fly and having multiple things with one foot switch. I do think maybe that's the conclusion that I'm coming to here, was just like, if you're going to be, you've already got an amp, you're considering going down the modelling route, do you necessarily need an FRFR? Maybe, maybe not. It's going to take up about the same amount of space. Is there an argument that maybe your tone might be just as good on stage if you just figured out a hybrid route? Maybe.
That's bigger.
Is it? Can you come and look at the other one closer and see if you're sure?
Come.
Right, and is this a smaller rig? Is this smaller? Oh,
Oh no. That's broken.
it should be
Oh,
alright.
do you want to fix it?
That's a microphone.
It's a microphone, is it? Oh, does them out.
Oh, she's literally better than most techs already.
There you go. Put it in then. There we go. Right on it. That's it.
Fixed.
Fixed.
That fits, yeah.
Right, and is this smaller?
Yeah, that's bigger.
This one's bigger too. So they're about the same, are they?
Make a song.
You make a song?
Make a song and really noisy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
they
which
are
is
big.
bigger?
Which one's bigger out of those two?
Which is biggest?
That one bigger.
Okay.
Is she wrong?
That one biggest too.
Okay, they're both big. Pretty much the same, you're saying?
That's a car.
Yes.
That's a fan. That's mine.
Useless considerations, but considerations nonetheless. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on that. Have you kind of switched from a pedalboard to a modeler to an FRFR? There's like some of these costs and things that we don't really consider sometimes, and maybe sticking with what you've already got might in some cases just be better off anyway. If you're thinking like tonally you're already happy with your amp, yeah, I don't know. If you've got to go into in-ear monitors as well, that's another thing to consider, where like, is the amp any longer as desirable then? When in cases like that, I think my buddy Jake has kind of gone down the route of just using a modeler because he's fed up with sound people saying to him like, this is too loud, can you turn down for the entire gig? Whereas he just used a Fractal FM3 and in-ears, you know, it's an easy compact rig. Similarly, if you use like a Quad Cortex or an HX Stomp and just the in-ears if you were playing in a church or something like that, I think that idea of having just the guitar, the modelling unit, you know, two hands and you're in, it's quite a nice idea, but for me, I really prefer having some amount of stage volume if I've got the choice to.